For the second morning session, we're going to move to a slightly different perspective, which will be offered by my dear friend, colleague, and former student, Alex Loftus. He has an undergraduate degree from the University of Edinburgh. He did his master's at Queen's University in Canada. While he was there, he carried out fieldwork in Buenos Aires, reinforcing a conviction that the Washington Consensus is a deeply perilous venture and confirming the ways in which critical academic work could contribute to understandings of the possibility for alternative futures. His doctoral research at the University of Oxford looked at the politics of water in Durban, South Africa, and he has continued to build on such convictions in what is perhaps an even more contradictory city. After finishing his DPhil in 2005, he was awarded the very prestigious RC UK Academic Fellowship at Royal Holloway, University of London, where he has been a lecturer until 2010, after which he moved to King's College Department of Geography. He has been a prolific author. He co-edited together with Farhana Sultana a book on the right to water. Then, fresh off the press, he edited together with Michael Eckers, Julian Hart, Stefan Kipfer, a wonderful book on Antonio Gramsci, the notorious Marxist and communist, on space, nature, and politics. But he also is the author of Everyday Environmentalism, a book I can very highly recommend to all of you, and I think that's the theme of his talk today. Thank you very much for being here, and looking forward to listening to Everyday Environmentalism. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you, okay, I really wasn't sure how I should structure today's talk, and I thought I would. So Creighton's been incredibly helpful in providing some suggestions of how I could structure the session, but I also thought if I sat in on John's talk, then I could kind of follow the same pattern. So that part of the reason why I don't have the PowerPoint presentation is that I wanted to be able to adapt it so that it could kind of fit to the structure of the workshop. But I thought, so what I thought I'd do, the main thing I'm going to do is to talk about the book, Everyday Environmentalism. But as Creighton's already had to suffer a fairly awful presentation that I gave on that at the LSE a few months ago, then I thought I'd try and change that a bit too, and adapt the talk a little more so that it could speak to the particular moment that the PhD fellows in particular are at. So I thought I'd try and kind of contextualize or situate the ideas that emerge in the book by looking at where I've worked in the past and how my ideas have shaped, developed, transformed, and come together within the book. So I'll sort of give a bit more of a kind of an extended biography to add to the bit that Eric's already kindly given, to situate the ideas. Then I'll talk in a little more detail about the book, and then I'll drill down into one of the chapters in the book, which is the chapter on Gramsci. And then I'll bring that chapter on Gramsci into closer conversation with Marx's theses on Feuerbach, because that is what I would like to focus on for my next project. So I'm kind of looking back as a way of thinking forwards. And then I'll kind of conclude with a few points around a conversation between Gramsci and Marx around the theses on Feuerbach. So that's the plan. So to begin with, the biography, how I got to where I did. So as Eric said, I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Edinburgh. It was a particular moment in the 1990s where geography was dominated by debates around post-structuralism, much excitement around this, and the course was taught in a way that really brought together these ideas. There was lots of excitement, lots of discussion of Foucault at that particular time, but also an oddly kind of, considering the lessons that we might take from post-structuralism, also an oddly kind of linear trajectory that much of the work associated with historical materialism had now been thoroughly critiqued, abandoned, rejected in favour of this bright new future which was around post-structuralism. This was where the discipline was at, and this was where it was going to be pioneered. I got a lot from the degree. I enjoyed it. But then I went on to do a master's degree at Queen's University in Canada. And when I was studying there, so it was a 2-year master's degree programme, when I was studying there, I came across this really peculiar paper in the Scottish Geographical Journal called, I think the title was something like The Spectre of Historical Geographical Materialism, which was written by Eric, and it completely blew me away and totally went against much of what I got from my undergraduate degree, that this bright new future was all about Foucault. It was looking back as a way of looking forward, again, looking at the roots of the discipline, of radical geography, looking at a sense of commitment to a world-changing project and how geography could do something there. At the time I was beginning to plan my dissertation research, which, as Eric said, was looking at water privatisation in Buenos Aires. I didn't at the time know that this author of this piece on the spectre of historical geographical materialism had done all this amazing research on water too. So I started to read more and more of it. And started to read also at the same time Neil Smith's work, Uneven Development, and Harvey's work in Limits to Capital. At that time as well, at the time of the master's dissertation, in Queen's University, which is in a town called Kingston in Ontario, which is about halfway between Toronto and Montreal. This was between 1999 and 2001, and it was a really special moment, I think, for social movements around the world. The battle in Seattle had taken place in 1999, in December 1999, and we, as graduate students, were really, really energised and excited by what was taking place there. In Canada at the time, and in Kingston, there were all sorts of really, really inspirational, rooted activists who were inspired by anarchist theories and anarchist perspectives, who hadn't normally had many conversations with people at the university, who they tended to regard as pretty snobbish, detached, disengaged. But we, as students, learned so much from this ragtag band of activists. And it sought to reshape, I think, for what we as graduate students were doing. It reshaped a lot of that work. It helped to give some substance to what we were doing, I think. At the time, there was a big protest that took place in Quebec City against the establishment of the free trade area of the Americas. It was the most wonderful carnivalesque protest, but also one which was suppressed by some fairly serious violence on the part of the Canadian state. But we, as graduate students working with activists in Kingston, managed to shut down the main thoroughfare that leads from Kingston all the way up to Quebec City for a few brief, a couple of hours, as we led a slow-moving convoy that shut down the flows of trade that we were so opposed to, and sought to enable activists who were coming over the border from the US, sought to help we were going to shut down that border to flows of trade until those activists could pass. Those activists had already been told they weren't going to be able to pass. So there was some really, really exciting stuff happening around this politics. The master's dissertation, anyway, was looking at water privatisation. I was really lucky to be able to work with a band of scholars who were working closely with some union groups. I was ended up working with some union groups and some activist academics within Buenos Aires, learnt a lot from them too. And the dissertation came out, and I was incredibly fortunate in being able to then go on to a PhD to work with Eric and kind of give some substance to these ideas, which were still quite fragmentary. You know, I knew about Limits to Capital, I'd read it, but I hadn't really studied it in the depth in which I needed to. By some fortunate occurrence, I was then able to teach Eric's tutorials on that went with his lectures on the Limits to Capital, and really had to study it. You know, people say that you don't really get to know something until you've had to teach it, and I think that really came out. And those ideas then, and also the work from Neil Smith's Uneven Development, came together, I think, within the PhD, which was looking at Durban. But partly the Durban project was because of a network of academics who, so the Buenos Aires work was part of a bigger project called the Municipal Services Project, which was looking at the delivery of municipal services. Brought together, again, union groups, brought together social movements, and it was largely based in South Africa. But I had done my work in Buenos Aires as kind of a spin-off from this project. But I was really drawn to the debates that were taking place in South Africa at the time, in part because South Africa seemed to be this country where people had thrown off the shackles of apartheid, and the political situation looked up for grabs. It was somewhere where things didn't seem so fixed, frozen. Things seemed potentially changeable. There seemed like still openings for a transformative politics within South Africa. So, having applied to work with Eric to look at Buenos Aires, I was really lucky to then change the PhD topic and end up working in Durban on something entirely different. And that was when the Durban work came together. I was also, for the field work, so I conducted the field work in South Africa between 2002 and 2003. And I was also really fortunate to be able to work with my partner, who received a research fellowship from the University of KwaZulu-Natal in Durban. So we worked together quite closely. She'd come from a kind of an international politics, international relations background, where they'd also been reading some stuff, some of the neo-Gramscian debates, and how Gramsci had been enrolled into international relations theory, some of which seemed quite relevant, so we were kind of toying with these ideas around Gramsci. And also within South Africa itself, there was a broader discussion of Gramsci, partly influencing debates within the South African Communist Party, and also influencing some of the debates for the social movements. So Gramsci began to figure more prominently within both the discussions that Fiona and I were having and also within my own work. Then, then finish up the PhD and seek to take forward some of these ideas. And I think if one thing really guides what I'm interested in, I think we have to look back to those debates within historical geographical materialism. I think it provides one of the most solid, profound critiques of the topsy-turviness of the world in which we live. That kind of, the perverted reality in which we go about our day-to-day business, that very often provokes anger at the injustice of it all, that for young graduate students provokes us into going to the protests against the free trade area of the Americas in Quebec City. So historical geographical materialism for me provides that really solid base. Smith's work, Neil Smith's work, in particular his work on the production of nature, I think, provides a really, really solid basis from which to make sense of an environmental politics within that too. Smith, I think, has done one of the most amazing jobs. And again, I think Smith is kind of neglected within many of the debates around eco-Marxism. He's not seen as part of the canon that's generally associated with John Bellamy Foster, Paul Burkett, and other people like that. He's kind of a bit of an oddity in relation to those debates. But I think Smith actually does something more interesting in kind of delving into the archaeology of Marx's writings on nature and piecing together, as he refers to, a jigsaw, putting back together the jigsaw, the fragmented pieces of which are laid out within Marx's writings, to think through where an environmental politics might lie. Of course, Smith's concern within uneven development was not directly with that environmental politics, even though he begins with the ideology of nature, moves on to the production of nature, but of course he's building to this grander argument about the production of space and around uneven development and gentrification. I always use that example with my undergraduate students, that this book is so, in a way, it's such a bizarre thing to move from the ideology of nature to gentrification within the city at the end of the book. How does it manage to do that? I think it's the product of someone who's able to look at what really matters within Marx And in part, I think what really matters is the method which Smith comes out with. It's a method for approaching the understanding of society. It's one which is deeply historically informed, and it's one which is deeply sensitive to spatial difference. So, historical geographical materialism. So if there's one thing that motivates my work, sorry to go back to that, historical geographical materialism, building on the environmental politics within uneven development, which looks back to Marx. But where I think uneven development doesn't take things is to try and think through what that might mean for a genuinely transformative politics. It implies it. It implies it throughout. And there are all sorts of suggestive moments within the book. But I think we have to do the work to think through what politics might emerge from that. And for me, what I'm interested in is how that politics might emerge not necessarily in the kind of carnivalesque big protests that inspired me around the free trade area of the Americas, the opposition to that, and the anti-corporate globalization demonstrations in the early 2000s. Not necessarily those big, those larger moments, but understandings that might emerge from day-to-day interactions and the day-to-day acts of what Smith refers to as producing nature. So I'm kind of interested in the flat in which I live in South London. Living in the flat down below is a single mum who has been on disability benefits for the last 7 or 8 years. She lives with her daughter, who's now 17, 18 years old. The flat itself is a council-owned flat. I'm interested in what an environmental politics might mean for her. I'm interested in what her everyday practices of providing food for her and her daughter whilst negotiating the benefit system and the various tests which she has to submit to on a frequent basis to prove her disabilities. I'm interested in where a politics might emerge from that kind of situation. When I look from our flat at the ginormous tower block that's situated on the hill above us, I'm interested in an environmental politics that might work through that tower block. That isn't about the preservation of green spaces within the city. That isn't about an exclusionary concept of nature which seeks to differentiate it from human practice. I'm interested in one that builds from that practice, that works through the tower block, that works through the day-to-day practices of the single mum living in the flat below. So that's it. Those are the two interests. Building from historical geographical materialism, excavating it further, but thinking through the politics that might emerge in relation to everyday practices. And so these are some of the ideas that come together within the book, and through an engagement with both the politics of water in Durban, and in particular with the act of provisioning a household with water on a daily basis, seeing that as a process which has changed historically and varies geographically across the city, seeing the power relations that enable it in particular moments and that constrain it in particular moments, and looking at the potential, if you like, the conditions of possibility for a transformative politics to emerge within that. So how do I go about doing that within the book? Firstly, I go back to that kind of methodological project. And if you remember, that's what I feel is one of the most important contributions of Smith's book, that he looks at what Marx's method might be to understand nature. And it's a historically and geographically informed methodology, if you like. Marx's methodological project, then, I think we need to also gain a better understanding of what Marx means by dialectics. And I think we need to look at the kind of relational, process-based understanding which is enabled by Marx's dialectical framing. I think this is about grasping change. seeing the world as something which is not necessarily fixed, fast, frozen, even though that's the form in which it presents itself, but is continually changing. I think we need to understand how it changes in relation to other things, which are also understood relationally and as process-based. Again, Harvey's work, so much of the time when I was working on the PhD, I was engaging with his Justice, Nature and the Geography of Difference, where he lays out his, is it 11 or 12 principles of dialectics. And I find that an incredibly useful way into understanding this methodological project, if you like. Harvey's also more recently laid out a kind of more, it's almost more of a teaching aid on dialectics, where he turns to a certain footnote in Marx's Capital. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with that or not, but he's used it both in his Reading Marx's Capital book, in his Cosmopolitanism book. It also came out in a little piece in the journal Human Geography, and it's also in the Enigma of Capital. He's used it several times recently, and he talks about this one footnote within Volume 1 of Capital, where Marx argues that technology reveals the active relation of man to nature. And he goes on a bit further. And he says, what's Marx doing with this particular footnote? Well, he seems to be laying out the basis for his dialectical approach. And Harvey says, if we want to drill further into this, what do we find? And he says, we seem to find 6 active moments that are all interrelated. They're all productive of this broader assemblage or this broader ensemble. And the 6 active moments that he identifies are the relation to nature, social relations, so the relations between different groups within society, between men and women, between different races, between different groups on the basis of sexuality, however we define these groups socially. So social relations. Relations of production, perhaps the main way in which we might think that Marx understands this broader ensemble. So the relations of production, technological relations, ideas, everyday life. How many have I done? Have I done 5 or 6? I can't remember. Have I only done 5?
No, I think it's not
6. Okay, 6. I think that's it. He's also brought in later institutions, and we might begin to think of those. So these are all internally related. And he says the dangers of any the dangers of any radical political project is to focus solely on one of those moments and to see that as the sole transformative moment. So to take the relation to nature, if we simply change our environments, then we change the societies which exist within them, an environmental determinist effect. If we simply change the relations of production, then we change everything within our society and get rid of all forms of injustice. If we simply get the ideas right, then we change the world. Harvey says you have to begin with one of those, but you always have to recognise the way in which it's internally related to each of the other moments. And to neglect those internal relations is to fall back on a form of determinism which is deeply problematic. So again, if there's a methodological project embarked upon by Marx, I think at the heart of that is this dialectical approach. And again, I think we can see this within Lukács's definition of what is orthodox Marxism. And he writes that for any orthodox Marxist, it would be possible for any of Marx's individual theses to be rejected in toto, to be disproved entirely, but that would not necessarily imply a rejection of Marx's works, because what matters for orthodox Marxism is method, and that method for Lukács is the dialectical approach. So that dialectical approach and the method is one of the things which I'm particularly interested in the book. I'm also interested in this being a creative project. And I think very often when we think of Marx, very often when, such as in my undergraduate degree, Marx is portrayed as someone solely interested in the economic sphere, with very little or no interest in aspects of creativity, certainly no interest in aesthetics. And this is an absolute parody of Marx's work, because of course he was deeply involved in a creative project, deeply inspired by works of literature. Even conservative writers like Balzac inform and infuse his work throughout. So within the book Everyday Environmentalism, the subtitle of the book is Creating an Urban Political Ecology. And I'm interested in how the work of making a political ecology, producing a nature, can also be viewed as a creative project. And this kind of involves going back to some debates around politics and aesthetics, and around everyday life as a work of art. So the book itself is about an imminent critique of everyday life, which I'll get on to in a second. But it involves, in a way, building on Loftus' call to make everyday life a work of art. It also, running through the book, is what might be termed a philosophy of praxis, a term which Gramsci gives the most specificity to, if you like. This, I think, is about a particular fusion of theory and practice. And there are all sorts of ways that theory and practice can be brought together. But I think the notion of a philosophy of praxis, certainly as Gramsci understands it, is that a transformative politics emerges from the kind of fragmented world of common sense, which is intimately related to those everyday acts of making the world as it is. So transformative politics emerges from the everyday act of making the world as it is. If we understand the production of nature to be the basis for a political ecology, then the production of nature and the production of everyday natures becomes the basis for a transformative political project. I think within that, though, there are all sorts of problems. We can see how this fragmented worldview that Gramsci refers to as common sense might go in many different directions. It might articulate to profoundly different political projects. It might be taken up within a populist political project. And thinking through, historicising the emergence of these fragmentary worldviews and how they're linked to the production of nature is part of the book. It also looks at everydayness and the everyday, and this imminent critique of everyday life, and the notion that critical thinking is imminent to the process of making the world as it is. It also, and most of you will be comfortable with the idea, takes on the idea that there's no such thing as nature. But at the same time, I think I'm also deeply conscious in the book that of the criticisms of Marxism in the past, that forms of Marxism that developed, or some strains of Marxism that developed, and always I'm understanding Marxism as a terrain of debate, not necessarily a single canon, a terrain of debate but largely centred on this methodological project. So some threads of Marxism kind of shed the material base which was so fundamental to historical materialism, got rid of the nature, abandoned that. In part, you can see the reasons for that. Much of the discussion of nature in the past has been dominated by Malthusian perspectives, which have sought to naturalise forms of injustice. So for Marxism, looking to a social project, it seeks to kind of eschew those, any discussion of nature, because it's seen as inherently problematic. So when, in arguing that there's no such thing as nature, I'm also looking to a project, as has been brilliantly articulated within Eric's work, within Maria's work, which seeks to better understand how society and nature can be seen as co-evolving moments, if you like. We might talk of socio-natures, we might talk about metabolisms as a way of seeking to get beyond naturalised understandings, whilst also incorporating the fact that matter matters, if you like. The material is fundamental to an environmental politics. So And also I seek to kind of do justice to an environmental movement. I don't seek to necessarily reject that, whilst also recognising that an environmental movement, it can be deeply problematic. It can fall back on those very determinisms that we seek to reject, or that some of us seek to reject. So it does this in various ways. It structures it in a way which I think now is maybe a bit problematic, but it structures it around different thinkers. The thinkers that the book is focused on are Marx, and in particular I focus on his early writings. Because I think the discussion of nature there, even though it's been critiqued, I find it particularly interesting because of its focus on the senses, and the way in which the senses become so crucial to mediating these relationships. It then looks at Lukács, in a way, because of Lukács's writings, seems to provide the basis for these kind of situated knowledges. And these situated knowledges always emerging within a broader dialectical understanding of socio-natures. Lukács was, in part, one of the influences on feminist standpoint theory as it emerged within the 1980s. And this, for me, becomes really crucial for thinking through broader forms of production. So feminist standpoint theory emerges and argues that within Marx we find a fundamental standpoint methodology. Marx is seeking within Capital Volume 1 to find the standpoint of the proletariat. He's writing Capital as a critique of political economy from the standpoint of the proletariat. Feminist standpoint theory said, great, let's use this standpoint methodology, but if we only understand practical activity as wage labour, then we miss the vast majority of practical activity as it exists in the world at the present moment. So look instead at the gender division of labour. And if we understand this gender division of labour, then we also understand how acts of social reproduction become fundamental to the emergence of forms of consciousness about the way in which the world is structured. So feminist standpoint, so I kind of bring feminist standpoint theory into conversation with Lukács in that chapter. And also some of Donna Haraway's writings on the sideboard, which emerges, I think, from that kind of feminist standpoint trajectory, but it's very often been forgotten, I think, within some of the work on the sideboard. Then I turn to Gramsci and try to think, and I'll go into some more detail on this in a second, about the emergence of worldviews and what happens to those worldviews. Then I return to some of the debates around critical spatial practice in relation to Lefebvre. So there's kind of this hodgepodge of different theorists, and then concrete examples are woven through the different chapters. Again, the work from South Africa is woven through some of the chapters, and also engagements with urban interventions within London, some of the work of the group CityMind, another one of Eric's PhD students, and how these urban interventions seek to recraft the political ecology of the city in different ways. So I'm kind of engaging with those two concrete moments throughout the book. So now's the kind of odd time when the reviews start to come out on the book. And most of them have been quite nice, but one of them is about to come out, and it's really not very nice at all. And so the title of the review is City of Ivory Towers. And the whole basis of it is that I approach the city from these theorists, and I seek to look out from... I don't understand where these ivory towers are anymore. It seems a cliche to talk about this ivory tower when our universities have been so restructured in the image of capital. The spaces in which we might be these disengaged thinkers are almost non-existent. The book itself was written in engagement with residents of this one particular informal settlement in Durban. It was also written in those moments between the next load of washing and the dash to the school gate to pick up my daughter from school or nursery. So this ivory tower, for me, just doesn't exist. But in order to try and convince you of this, I'll focus on perhaps one of the less representative chapters in the book, which is that on Gramsci, which really drills into some of the empirical details of this, or the concrete details of this one informal settlement, Inanda, in Durban. So my PhD research, as I say, was based in Durban. It was looking at the politics of water provision in the city. And what I was really interested in was how South Africa had developed a free basic water policy, which had become a leading example to many cities around the world. It was, it seemed to show the way in which a free basic allowance of water could be provided within middle-income countries at relatively low cost, simply by redistributing within the water sector itself. At the same time, Durban, at the time that I was doing research, was disconnecting 4,000 households from the water supply every week. 4,000 households. If we assume that 4 people live in each of those households, which would be a very low estimate, huge numbers of people in Durban were being disconnected from the water supply in a context in which they had been guaranteed free basic water. So I tried to make sense of this situation within the PhD, and I became particularly interested in the kind of the political economy of the bulk water arrangements, how water was being sold to the city, how this could be traced back to the apartheid settlement. In many respects, the formation of this bulk water provider within the city of Durban was entirely related to justifying apartheid as a project of separate development. So bulk water providers created, it's then commercialised in the post-apartheid period. So this was part of the problem. There were various court cases in Durban, many activists involved both in challenging the court judgments that were made and in challenging the municipality. I was less interested in the kind of, again, in the kind of high-profile cases which were very well documented by people like Patrick Bond, by Ashwin Desai, by many others, who have done a brilliant job of documenting the recent history of these struggles to concretise the right to water as it is guaranteed within the 1996 Constitution in South Africa. So their work does a brilliant job of it. Ashwin Desai, in particular, focuses on the emergence of social movements within one area of the city of Durban, in Chatsworth. Other people like Richard Pithouse have done some phenomenal work with the shack dwellers movement in Durban, and these very organised inspirational groups which were emerging and have emerged over the last 10 or 15 years within South Africa. In some ways, again, what I wanted to know was what was happening in those parts of the city where there didn't seem to be any active opposition to the disconnections. How were people getting by? Were people just putting up with it? How did they make sense of the situation? Were they just simply so passively loyal to the ANC that they would put up with these disconnections and somehow struggle to get by? And so this, in part, drew me and Fiona working at the same time further and further into this informal settlement in Inanda. Inanda is the most fascinating place. It's a large informal settlement, about 30 kilometres from the centre of Durban. The history of the settlement is an interesting one because the 1936 Land Act in South Africa had assigned this area of land on which the informal settlement grew up as a released area. These released areas, the intention was that the state would eventually buy up the land for sole African occupancy. But prior to that, it enabled Africans and Indians, these are the apartheid categories, to coexist within one area. So it kind of disrupted the apartheid project in some respects. African freehold land was possible within this settlement right up until the 1980s. It was possible. So this released area, Inanda grew up within this released area. Basically, the area became dominated by some African landowners and some Indian landowners who were farming shacks within their areas of land. So shacks grew up, they would pay a rent to a landlord. And water provision in the area was basically dependent on either the benevolence of the landlord or the landlord's attempt to seek some kind of commercial advantage, so to sell the water which came from one particular borehole. So it was a somewhat impoverished area, and the political ecology of the area, if you like, was shaped by its relation to the apartheid state, the intentions of the apartheid state, and this fragmented land ownership and the landlord-tenant relationship. It also posed, so a large township was built next to Inanda, Kwamashu. These townships, of course, were the containers of labour that fueled the apartheid city, that inspired, on which the apartheid city depended, but also showed up the contradiction of the city, that separate development was supposedly one in which white and black would live in entirely separate states. But of course, it depended on forms of labour, which had to exist in close proximity to the city. So anyway, this township was built up close to Inanda. And this then enabled residents of the informal settlement in the 1960s and 70s to be able to commute relatively easily to the city. So the informal settlement gradually becomes integrated within the city, even though it's still this kind of liminal peripheral area that's not supposed to exist. It's released, it's kind of in this administrative limbo. It's not really part of South Africa, it's not really part of the intended KwaZulu-Bantustan. So it's this odd liminal space, which is, because of the extension of infrastructure, becoming increasingly enrolled into the flows and processes of the city. The city becomes very concerned in the 1980s that this burgeoning population within the informal settlement has no basic services, and typhoid could break out, which could then threaten the city itself. So what does it do about it? It's a released area, it doesn't want to formalise the informal, it doesn't want to provide services to this illegal or potentially illegal, this kind of semi-legal situation. It doesn't want to provide services, but it has to, because the white population of Durban might be threatened if typhoid breaks out within this informal settlement. So it seeks to develop all sorts of ways of providing water to this informal settlement through a site and service scheme, and supposedly this was one of the first site and service schemes of anywhere in the world, where a site was provided with a tap, and the expectation was that the people living on that plot would build their own shack, which would gradually be formalised further and further, and this process of formalisation would lead to a viable settlement on the basis of that. So a site and service scheme is started within this, which gradually begins to break the dominance of the landlords within this settlement. At the same time, still, Inanda is known as a place of relative interracial harmony. It was the site of where these kind of teach-ins and reading camps would take place on Gandhi's former settlement when he lived in Durban, Phoenix. So it becomes really interesting because of this. But then the site and service scheme begins to unsettle this, and at the same time, drought is beginning to put greater pressure on the landlord-tenant relations, and the apartheid state is trying to exploit this further and further by claiming that the landlords are responsible for the lack of provision of services within the area. This leads to tensions between the African tenants and the Indian landlords. By 1985, there's the murder of a prominent activist in a very different part of Durban, and then violence breaks out right the way across Inanda. And this moment of what some had understood to be a moment of brief interracial harmony seems to be shattered and fractured as some incredibly violent turf wars take place within Inanda between Inkatha and the Comrades movement. So in opposition to apartheid, you had the civics in the late years of apartheid. Within KwaZulu, you have the Comrades movement, which seems to be this kind of youth, driven by the youths, very often quite a militant opposition to apartheid. So the comrades phenomenon within Inanda really takes off, but very often this is focused on these quite violent turf wars between Inkatha and the comrades movement. So anyway, this goes on until the dying days of apartheid in 1989. And what then happens, as Inkatha seems to be crushed within Inanda, is that the comrades reform into what they call themselves as the Inanda Marshals. This was somewhat like a militia, but they become sort of the de facto administration for Inanda, which still lies outside of any administrative control. And they divvy up the land of the area and distribute it, and again begin to reshape the political ecology and the socio-natural relations of that particular part of Durban by dividing up the land. They were an incredibly benevolent, by social historians' accounts, an incredibly philanthropic, well-organised group. And again, crucial to the research which I did for the PhD was the involvement of one of the Inanda Marshals, a guy called Tulani, who had been one of the key Inanda Marshals responsible for this distribution of land, one of the most inspirational people I have ever met. Tulani, anyway, then becomes part of this group which emerges from the Inanda Civic Association, turns into the Inanda Development Forum, and this group, again, distribute land and negotiate between landowners and seek to bring services to Inanda, where it formerly hadn't had services, seek to ensure that water is provided within the settlement. This group is seen as a potential source of opposition to the ANC. It's seen as somewhat uncontrollable. So the ANC says rather than having the Inanda Marshals, firstly, are seen as a potential source of opposition. Rather than having this unruly autonomous group responsible for the provision of services and the distribution of land within the settlement, the ANC wanted to establish its tentacles within the settlement. So it establishes the ANC Youth League and seeks to disband the Inanda Marshals. Tulani, who had worked within the Marshals and within the ANC, is then expelled from the ANC. He's a Trotskyist, he's to be thrown out. He keeps turning up at meetings, he's never actually thrown out. He doesn't quite understand what it is to be thrown out. Continues to be part of it. It's very much his political understanding that he will work with different groups at different times. Anyway, by the mid-1990s, as the post-apartheid project is beginning to take some shape, experimentations take place around private sector provision. And the hope is that Durban will sell its municipal service provision and bulk water provision to a large French multinational who will provide it for phenomenally cheap rates, will extend the network and do all those amazing things that private sector companies are meant to do. In actual fact, what happens is this small tri-sector partnership between supposed civil society, between business, Veolia Water, and the municipal water provider. This tri-sector partnership develops within Durban and again seeks to reconfigure the political ecology of the settlement, but in particular around this notion of the individual fee-paying consumer of services. If this tri-sector partnership had one goal, it seems to be to make people pay for their services. So I kind of trace in the chapter this historical geography of this one settlement and how from this changing historical geography we might begin to make sense of the political ecology of the settlement. But I also seek to do this in relation to what might be understood to be the common sense of Inanda. And common sense I understand to be this fragmented worldview. Gramsci seems to define the subaltern in relation to the fragmentary basis of the subaltern group's understanding, in part. So common sense is about this fragmentary, these fragmentary understandings, the kernel of which can be good sense. So there's the potential for these radical perspectives to emerge within this fragmented common sense worldview. And I seek to kind of trace the emergence of this at particular times, how a radical progressive political movement was galvanised in one moment, and then it seems to disappear in other moments. How it comes up again, and how this can always be related to the engineering of the political ecology of this particular settlement. So how ideas can be understood to be internally related to the technologies of providing water, to the relations of production, to the social relations, to everyday life, I can't remember, institutions. So how it can be internally related to each of these. So that's what I'm trying to do within this chapter, to see where the potentials might lie within the present moment, and to seek to begin to understand these. And I think one way in which I might have taken them forward further is in relation to the Gramscian person and this notion of the person. And Gramsci, throughout Gramsci's writings, the figure of the subject seems to be almost completely absent. In actual fact, Gramsci seems to write much more about this figure of the person, this persona. That people adopt a different persona at different times. In some ways, it has some similarities to the Althusserian notion of interpolation. But it also, I think, more directly comes from the theses on Feuerbach. Sorry, this is the loop. The theses on Feuerbach, then, in the sixth thesis on Feuerbach. For those of you who don't know the theses on Feuerbach, I don't know. So Marx wrote them in 1845. They were never intended for publication. They're 11 brief theses, both his critique of crude forms of materialism as they'd existed in the past, and his critique of forms of idealism as they were represented within the young Hegelians. So Marx's critique of both this crude materialism and this idealism as it existed in the past comes together within these 11 brief notes. And if I ever wanted anyone to read 2 pages of Marx's writings, I think it would be the thesis on Feuerbach, because I think it's the neatest distillation of his ideas. But within the sixth thesis, he argues that for Feuerbach, this notion of human nature appears as an abstraction. Feuerbach seems to write about this essential human nature as it exists through time. And Marx critiques this and says there is no single abstraction. Instead, human nature should be viewed as an ensemble of social relations. An ensemble of social relations. Gramsci seems to take this forward throughout the prison writings, and many people have argued that for the prison writings, the thesis on Feuerbach are the single most important inspiration. Prison writings can be understood to be a long grappling with the theses on Feuerbach, these 11 brief notes written by Marx. So the sixth thesis around the person and around this ensemble of social relations, Gramsci seems to do something different. He understands a person also in relation to nature. He makes that quite explicit. So if we to understand human nature in one particular historical moment, we can understand it in relation not simply to the social relations, our relations with others, but also our relations to our environments. Human nature is in part about our engagements with our environments. So the Gramscian person, as a historically and geographically specific figure, which changes according to historical and geographical circumstances, is changing in relation to one's engagement with nature and one's engagement with other people. So that's kind of how I think the comrades movement, the civics, and the political ecology and the conditions of possibility within that informal settlement are emerging in relation to historically and geographically specific relations between people and between people and their environments. It's continually transforming in those. So I think a political ecology can contribute something in seeking out those radical possibilities in historicising and spatialising those socio-natural relations. So, again, you can go into other of the theses on Feuerbach to find interesting things. The educated too must be educated. The dialectical form of pedagogy that Gramsci seems to see as so fundamental, and that also guides the theses on Feuerbach. So, to summarise, the 3 things that I would want you to take away from the book and from the chapter, I think it would be the importance of praxis, a particular understanding of the fusion of theory and practice and how we think about that relationship. I would also hopefully want you to take away a sense of this dialectical pedagogy that the educated too must be educated, and that we're always educated in relation to the environment of which we are a part. And then finally, how to advance to a politics through always remaining in contact with the common sense of a particular place and a particular environment. This fragmented common sense. For Gramsci, a transformative politics can only emerge if it remains in contact with that common sense. It can't begin from anywhere else. It cannot begin from the ivory towers. It can only begin from the earthliness of thought, as he refers to it, the absolute secularization and earthliness of thought. So that would be something that I would hope that you would take away from my brief summary of that particular chapter in the book, this engagement with the absolute secularization and earthliness of thought. So the importance of praxis, the notion of dialectical pedagogy, and the advancing to a politics who always remaining in contact with common sense. So, a bit of a kind of, maybe covered too much, but hopefully you will take something away from that. Thank you.